Hello, I am Jessie, and my group mates Emily and Rachael and I decided to look into the recent overturning of Roe versus Wade that happened in the United States recently. So our research outline starts with an introduction and a brief history on Roe versus Wade by Emily. It'll then go into looking into who is at stake, exploring the intersectionality of Roe versus Wade, as well as what actions are currently being made by myself, and then how the movement has contributed to transformative social change, and where the movement is currently in the work by Rachael.
Good afternoon. Our topic for our final presentation is the overturning of Roe versus Wade. What is Roe versus Wade and who initiated it? In 1969, a 25-year-old single woman, Norma McCorvey, using the pseudonym Jane Roe, challenged the criminal abortion laws in Texas. The state forbade abortion as unconstitutional except in cases where the mother's life was in danger. Defending the anti-abortion laws was Henry Wade, the district attorney for Dallas County, hence Roe versus Wade. When she filed the case, Miss McCorvey was pregnant with her third child and claimed that she had been raped. However, the case was rejected and she was forced to give birth. In 1973, her appeal made it to U.S. Supreme Court, where her case was heard alongside of a 20-year-old Georgia woman, Sandra Bensing. They argued that the abortion laws in Texas and Georgia went against the U.S. Constitution because they infringed a woman's right to privacy. By a vote of 7-2, the court justices ruled that governments lack the power to prohibit abortions. They judged that the U.S. Constitution protected a woman's right to terminate her pregnancy. How did this change women's rights at the time? The case created the trimester system, allowing an absolute right to an abortion in the first 3 months, so the trimester of a pregnancy, some government regulations in the second trimester, and states to restrict or ban abortions in the last trimester as the fetus nears the point where it could live outside the womb. Roe versus Wade also established that in the final trimester, a woman could obtain an abortion despite any legal ban, only if doctors certify it is necessary to save her life or health. Now, the overturning of Roe versus Wade. In 1973, the court ruled Roe v. Wade that pregnant women were entitled to an abortion during the first 3 months of their pregnancy while allowing for legal restrictions and bans in the second and third trimesters. Now the court has overturned that earlier ruling, effectively making it possible for states to ban abortions earlier than 12 weeks. Abortion will not automatically become illegal in the United States, but individual states will now be allowed to decide if and how to allow abortions. 13 states had passed trigger laws upon Roe versus Wade being overturned. Others have left old laws on the books that banned abortion before 1973, but now they could go back into that force. In the days that followed the ruling, several bans came into force, but some of those have been temporarily blocked by the courts, setting things up for further legal battles. Over the past decade, several states have also tried to pass laws making abortion illegal, except in a few circumstances, such as if the pregnant woman's life is at risk. Some of those laws were struck down by lower counts as they appeared to violate Roe v. Wade. However, now they will likely come back into full force. According to Guttmacher Institute, some 40 million women of childbearing age will live in the states where abortion will become more challenging to access safe abortions. This research organization supports abortion rights, and they calculated about 630,000 abortions were performed in the U.S. in 2019, according to Guttmacher and the U.S. Center for Disease Control. Although further research shows that it could be closer to 860,000 women. Now, how does this connect to the course readings? In one of the following readings, it was said by Hooks, 2000, individual female freedom fighters all over the world have single-heartedly struggled against patriarchy and male domination. Since the first people on the planet Earth were non-white, it is likely that white women were the first females to rebel against male domination. In white supremacist capitalist patriarchal Western culture, neo-colonial thinking sets the tone for many cultural practices. I believe this connects to the overturning of Roe versus Wade because of the Western cultural practices and the neo-colonial thinking is what made the decision in court that day. All women of different races, religions, and sexual orientation around the world are protesting as well as rebelling against the male domination. Second article linking to the overturning of Roe v. Wade was by Stewart in 2019 from the course. Power over is how power is most commonly understood. This type of power is built on force, coercion, domination, and control, and motivates largely through fear. This form of power is built on a belief that power is a finite resource that can be held by individuals, and that some have power and some people do not. The overturning of Roe v. Wade has power over women. This court decision has stricken fear in women across the United States as well as women across the globe, showing how much this decision impacts us. Like Stewart 2019 mentioned, this court ruling has created a power that has all of us in this feared state, a chokehold, if you will, that we no longer have the choice. And if worse comes to worse, we have to make the decision of getting an unsafe abortion or continuing with the pregnancy. The third article that I found that can relate to the overturning of Roe v. Wade was by Mullally, 2002, about oppression. He once said, oppression is generally understood as the domination of subordinate groups in society by a powerful politically, economically, socially, and culturally group. It entails the various ways that this domination occurs, including how structural arrangements favor the dominant over the subordinate group. Mullally, 2002. With the final verdict of Roe versus Wade, women's voices were starting to make an impact, but now those voices are significantly reduced. My apologies. Women were and still continue to be oppressed because of the choices being made in court for us by men who have no idea what we deal with on a daily basis. The people who made the court ruling will be praised for the decision made, but the other women who now have to get unsafe abortions, whether it be because of medical reasons, unwanted pregnancy, or the result of a rape, they cannot access them safely and will be heavily impacted in the future. The importance of Roe versus Wade in social justice and what us social workers can do. By leaving the decision whether or not to restrict or ban abortions to the states, the Supreme Court is granting permission for states to control the reproductive autonomy of their residents. Essentially, this will force millions of people into either birthing a child or risking their lives to obtain safe abortions. The anticipated state restrictions and bans will target communities of color with disproportionately poor access to safe and comprehensive sexual and reproductive health care due to centuries of systemic racism, as well as cultural oppression. Social workers will be vital in supporting access to comprehensive sexual and reproductive health care. In addition to access to essential abortion services, this support must include mental health and substance use services and navigation of criminal legal systems. In a moment when it might feel like there is nothing we can do to protect our constitutional right to safe abortions, we must stay as active as possible and focus on our advocacy efforts in helping those most impacted. As well as social workers and nurses are acutely aware that safe and affordable access to healthcare is essential to forming a just society. Reversing 50 years of precedent on abortion denies women access to safe reproductive health care, which is essential to their general health and the nation's health. It sends a very clear message of inequality from the highest court and the highest power. This decision will disproportionately affect women of color and individuals, children, and families of lower socioeconomic statuses. Social workers can start to educate themselves outside their state resources to help women and whoever with this issue. Learning about their lives and their struggle empowers us to be able to help them. Suppose we learn more about all the different cultures and religions and every aspect that can go into obtaining a safe abortion will now be gone. And so I believe if social workers possess the knowledge is the biggest power we have against the highest courts and people in charge in order to have the equality and the right to safe abortions as well as protective sexual health. Thanks. Thank you for listening to my portion of the presentation, and now there will be 2 more parts. Thank you. This is Emily, by the way.
Hello, my name is Jessie, and for my portion of the presentation, I will be looking at the intersectionality of Roe versus Wade being overturned, as well as some actions that are being taken to mitigate the issue. So given all of the background information on the overturning of Roe v. Wade by Emily, it is essential to understand what and who is at stake to assess any sort of mitigation technique. By examining who is at stake, it becomes easier to understand the intersectionality involved with the ruling and how it impacts multiple overlapping social justice issues that are intertwined with our social work. Things like race, sexuality, and class disparities. Intersectionality itself is a tool used in social work to analyze the different forms of oppression, such as racism, sexism, ableism, heterosexism, and classism, interact and intertwine to influence one's experiences. It has come to be recognized as an influential feminist approach for making sense of how inequalities manifest for individuals and groups. Everything that is Roe v. Wade is protected under 4 different amendments: the 1st, 4th, 9th, and 14th Amendment. All these amendments are highly complex, but the most critical one for this specific topic is the 14th Amendment, as it essentially provides a fundamental right to privacy. Indeed, right to privacy in the Constitution includes contraceptives, marriage, and child rearing. Because of Roe v. Wade, the court decided that the various zones of privacy were broad enough to encompass a woman's decision on whether to terminate her pregnancy via abortion. It is therefore, or was, a constitutional right that a woman has a choice over her own body. Roe v. Wade protects contraceptives. It protects the right to a cesarean C-section. It protects against imprisonment for women who are unable to bring their baby to term if they are disabled, carrying a stillbirth, or if they are undergoing chemo, COVID, or any life-threatening pregnancy. So, who is at stake given the decision to overturn Roe v. Wade? In the U.S., there are approximately 800 women who die every year due to pregnancy or childbirth-related issues. Additionally, 30% of women who struggle with postpartum depression form a mood, anxiety, or depressive disorder that can lead to suicide in the first year after giving birth. These women's lives are at stake due to the ruling to overturn Roe v. Wade. As such, women have become subject to oppression by the male-dominated patriarchy that enacted this ruling. Children are also at stake as underfunded and overstressed foster care systems will face new pressures following the ban on abortions. Approximately 424,000 children in foster care are already facing shortages of family placements, low high school graduation rates, and disproportionately high rates of incarceration and homelessness. Child support and foster funding is not increased now that Roe v. Wade has been overturned, thus making it clear that the court's decision is not meant to protect the lives of children. It is solely a display of power over women by the male-dominated patriarchy that has manifested itself within the U.S. government. It also blatantly ignores a child protection perspective that would seek to protect children from violence, exploitation, abuse, and neglect within the foster care system. But what is protected under Roe v. Wade extends beyond abortion and women's rights. Indeed, Roe v. Wade is an umbrella law, given that it is protected under the 14th Amendment. It therefore protected LGBTQ+ parents from discrimination when trying to reproduce their own children. Additionally, a member of the Supreme Court, Justice Clarence Thomas, wrote that the court should also reconsider Griswold v. Connecticut, Lawrence v. Texas, and Obergefell v. Hodges. These are the rulings that protect same-sex relationships and same-sex marriage. So not only are women's and children's rights being overturned, but the LGBTQ+ community is also being threatened with discrimination and the removal of their rights. Roe v. Wade was used as a precedent to legalize gay marriage, yet the Supreme Court argues that they need to correct the error of establishing these precedents. This is representative of a systematic process of privilege towards heterosexuality with regard to homosexuality that has become ingrained into the various institutions of the U.S. The overturning of Roe v. Wade also features implications with race in the U.S. Black women are approximately 3 times likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. Additionally, nearly a third of all abortions in the U.S. are provided to Black women. This makes the Black community proportionately the largest group impacted by the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Disparity in income among Black women is particularly important when seeking an abortion, as abortions themselves cost around $500 up front. Pair this cost with traveling out of state to avoid prosecution, and receiving the procedure becomes highly inaccessible to the 1 in 9 Black women who live below the poverty line. This represents a positive feedback loop of increasing poverty, overrepresentation of Black people in the criminal justice system and child welfare system, and restricted access to housing or employment that was created by systemic racism in the U.S. This will only deepen now that Roe v. Wade has been overturned. Although these disparities are associated with differences in individual level factors, it must be understood that these factors have become constrained and produced by larger structural inequalities like racism and poverty. As Bernard and Smith say, systemic racism creates conditions that seek to limit the life opportunities and quality of life for those seen as other. Again, we see evidence that pro-life advocates are not pro-quality of life. So now that we have a pretty basic understanding of the intersectionality involved within the overturning of Roe versus Wade, we can look into what actions are being taken. Currently, the most obvious action is voting. So the polls indicate that most U.S. citizens support the right for women to choose. However, white men represent a particularly powerful minority that contributes to decision-making. These men argue that reproductive rights are not represented within the Constitution, and therefore should be controlled by the elected representative of each state. States' rights versus federal rights have traditionally been used as a catalyst to enact the power of the elite, also known as white men. History has proven that unfortunate events can lead to fortunate changes, so the 2022 polls can demonstrate how the power of the vote can ensure that citizens who support women's rights to choose, and therefore anti-racist and anti-homophobic movements, to become overwhelming majority. By voting, women and supporters can elect leaders that have their best interest at heart while minimizing these ingrained power dynamics. So that concludes my section of our presentation, and I will now pass the mic over to Rachael.
The overturn of Roe v. Wade brings up the issue of privilege within America. Unfortunately, women still do not have the right over their own bodies, and their rights lie in the hands of the government. Relating this back to the problem of privilege, no one wants to admit to the potential oppression they may place on others. As for the Supreme Court who ruled over the right to abortion, the 5 who voted in favor will not admit to their imposed power over almost half of the American states. These restrictions are extremely dangerous and will lead to the mortality of women across the U.S. Unfortunately, the voices of 5 people outweigh the pleas from women who are in life-threatening circumstances. The problem with privilege is that it comes with an obscene amount of power. This power is merely impossible to overcome and will not be admitted to. This concept only reinstates more superiority, as no one wants to admit to fault. The feminist movement in the U.S. can be seen as something aggressive and distasteful. As Chimamanda explains in her We Should All Be Feminists TED Talk, her encounters with men surrounding the concept of injustice for women was usually met with confusion. Her male friends did not understand why women felt inferior, as they were blinded by their own privilege. As with the overturn of Roe v. Wade, males tend to be blinded by the harsh reality banning abortions brings, since it does not affect them directly. The concept of positionality is evident within the court ruling, as those who agree with its outcome are obviously not in a life-threatening situation. The position of an individual can be comprised of both gender and personal experience that lead us to acquire certain beliefs. Consequently, it is extremely important for people to understand where their positionality is derived and how it is outwardly portrayed. For example, most of the positions of power within the government are occupied by men. Unsurprisingly, their voices are heard more often, allowing their opinions to rule over those of women. The importance of self-reflection in social work practice is evident within the effects from Roe v. Wade, as power and oppression tend to shape a sense of identity. Self-awareness surrounding issues of sexism and race is necessary in positions of superiority, but unfortunately, self-realization is not always present. Understanding social theory and self-reflection is helpful in coming to a consensus which integrates all members of society. In the Supreme Court ruling, Americans were left in the hands of 5 people who issued their votes and ultimately changed women's basic rights. This decision is not only unjust, but also dangerous to those who may be in fatal circumstances. Just to bring awareness surrounding the effects of life without Roe v. Wade, the National Library of Medicine issued an article stating that most physicians have no knowledge of medicine before the overturn. This means that they are not familiar with the clinical complications that come with banning abortions. Even though restrictions have been placed, this does not mean that undercover abortions will still take place. Unfortunately, the unsanitary and dangerous practices usually lead to enemas and even death. What the government needs to understand is that banning safe abortions does not ban abortions altogether. There will still be ways to receive treatment, but not in medically safe scenarios. In conclusion, the overturn of Roe v. Wade was an event that will change the safety of women across America. Without the right to safely have an abortion, the potential risk for death and complications will increase. Being forced into having a child is something inhumane and imposes over basic human rights. As seen with concepts of privilege and power, individuals do not tend to admit to these faults, which only encourages supremacy. Realizing positionality and how it has an impact on our opinions is also something to be aware of. Men who cannot bear children are not directly affected by abortion laws, which in effect makes their perspectives of less validity. The only thing we can do as citizens is to continue to stand up for women's health and deny men the ability to control women's bodies.